Hey all, so for this video, we're going to be looking at D4.3, which is related to climate change, and looking at pages 777 to 789. And this is looking at the theme of continuity and change. So how are things staying the same? How are they changing? And the questions we're thinking about are, what are the drivers of climate change? And what are the impacts of climate change on ecosystems? And so firstly, we want to talk about greenhouse gases and how they warm up the earth. And so many of you have probably heard of different greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, CFCs, nitrous oxides. All of these are greenhouse gases, and carbon dioxide comes from the combustion of fossil fuels. Methane comes from melting permafrost, and then also from the harvesting of peat. Water vapor comes from evaporation, and then CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, come from air con and coolants, but that has been reduced because they were destroying the ozone layer, which is a totally separate issue from the greenhouse effect, but CFCs are also greenhouse gases. And then NOx, NOx, nitrous oxides, come from vehicle emissions due to high temperature combustion of fossil fuels. Oxygen and nitrogen are gases in the atmosphere that make up the majority of the gases in the atmosphere, and they are not greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide only makes up about 1% of the gases in our atmosphere, but it is greenhouse gas, and for that reason, its increasing concentration is problematic. We are currently entering an era, or now in an era, that scientists classify as the Anthropocene, and anthropogenic climate change is occurring, and the word anthropogenic means human caused. So the way that the greenhouse effect works is that all light comes in from the sun, and then some of that is reflected by the atmosphere. Some heats up the surface of the earth. About 70% of the light coming in heats up the surface of the earth. And once that heat reaches the surface of the earth, it's going to heat up the earth, and that heat is re-emitted from the earth's surface as infrared radiation. That infrared radiation, long wave radiation, is trapped by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and causes the atmosphere to warm up. Long-term changes in heat patterns from this warming process is going to affect weather, temperature, and precipitation. For example, water vapor can act as a heat sink, absorbing heat and reflecting it back to the earth. And this is why cloudy skies cool more slowly at night than clear skies will. So that also relates to the fact that water vapor is a greenhouse gas. So with climate change, there's a lot of positive feedback loops occurring, and positive feedback loop, unlike the negative feedback loops that we've looked at, which maintain a stable equilibrium, positive feedback loops amplify the process that created it. So the end product is amplifying a new equilibrium. So a good example of this in climate change is that ice melts from Arctic polar regions, and ice usually reflects light back and prevents absorption of light energy as heat. When that ice melts, the oceans are dark underneath, so they're going to absorb that heat, which will melt more ice, which will result in more dark oceans, which will result in more heating and more ice melting. So you can see how this is pushing a new equilibrium where there would be no ice at the poles. Permafrost stores frozen methane, CH4, and when it melts, methane, a greenhouse gas, comes out, which causes more heating, which causes more melting of permafrost, which then causes more release of methane. And actually, you can see these bubbles here are the release of methane from underground water sources, because frozen methane in oceans can be capped by ice. And then the warming oceans melt the cap, so more CH4 methane can be released, which then relates to more heating. So these are positive feedback loops. They're not the only ones, but they are a couple of the ones occurring that are pushing forward increasing heating. And as that increasing heating occurs, we are reaching a tipping point. And a tipping point is when the sum of the environmental changes and positive feedback cycles overwhelm the resilience of a system so that it can't go back to the way things once were. And the ecosystem will then convert into a different one. And it might take millions of years for things to go back to the way that they were. So an example of a tipping point could be related to an ecosystem specifically would be boreal forests, which are what we have in Finland. Store carbon dioxide and decomposition doesn't happen very quickly because it's quite cold most of the year. And so that's going to also store carbon dioxide or carbon, because that carbon is locked into the material that is not decomposing. Additionally, bacteria, when they're decomposing things, respire, and that produces carbon dioxide. But if that decomposition process is happening very slowly, then there's low production of carbon dioxide. But when things heat up, then that decomposition process happens more quickly. And additionally, if weather changes, then there's less water. So the forests become drier, which then causes more forest fires, which then burn the not decomposed stuff, as well as the trees, releasing carbon dioxide. Land fast ice is ice that is attached to Antarctica, and it's important for penguins to hunt and breed. If the ice breaks away, chicks can die because the ice actually shears off and falls in the ocean. And as a result, the eggs might just tip over into the ocean. In 2018, this actually happened, and it was very sad to watch. But additionally, if land-fast ice detaches from Antarctica or is just not present because it's not forming, then it can make hunting very difficult because there's just less area for the penguins to be accessing the sea. So these are situations that are occurring in our ecosystems currently that are changing these ecosystems that may end up, in the case of boreal forests, with forest fires coming through pretty regularly, could result in more grassland type environments. And this is actually what they are expecting might happen in the Amazon in the near future, that due to changing rainfall patterns, the Amazon may become a grassland. Additionally, diversity changes are occurring for organisms. So what organisms can live where? These are changes are occurring on mountaintops and related to different latitudes. So organisms that live high on mountains can't move up as warming occurs. The other organisms move up from lower down on the mountain and then start competing for resources higher up the mountain. And potentially competitive exclusion is happening here, where one species is outcompeting the others. This is also happening with latitudes. So migratory species are surviving better if they're going further north or south, resulting in population changes in their locations. Plants obviously cannot shift as quickly, so are maybe facing challenges based on the fact that it's getting too hot and dry for certain species to survive in those locations. And then warming oceans are affecting what species can live in oceans and at what depths. So warming oceans make the water more stable. And currently we have an ocean current system that includes a rising and falling of ocean water due to temperature and salinity changes that will then cool ocean water and also rise up nutrients off of the ocean floor, as well as sinking dead stuff, as well as algae down to the depths of the ocean. But if the water column is more stable, because there's less of a temperature gradient and it's less salty at the surface, the reason it becomes less salty is if the ice caps start melting, then a bunch of fresh water is added into the Gulf Stream. And this area of the end of the Gulf Stream is where water starts sinking back down. So that's that blue line there. And without it being very salty here, it won't sink. And this sinking pretty much drives the rest of this whole circulation process. So if it becomes less salty because all the fresh water is added to the ocean and therefore makes it less salty, then that sinking doesn't happen. And it keeps the heat at the surface of the ocean. Warm water holds less oxygen, which means then fish, which normally live relatively close to the surface, may have less oxygen available. So the fish are going to get smaller because their big bodies would require a lot of oxygen. It also will prevent nutrients from sinking or rising as the currents slow down to be used for food for different organisms. This image here is some data related to migratory pathways of different bird species. Another factor that's coming into play related to climate change is ocean acidification. So many of you have probably heard about coral bleaching. That's related to ocean acidification. So this is a byproduct of increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, as well as increasing temperatures. So as carbon dioxide concentrations increase, a lot of that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere goes into the oceans. It's absorbed into the oceans. And in a reaction with ocean water, it's going to form carbonic acid. And in forming carbonic acid, it is going to reduce the amount of carbonate ions available for organisms in the ocean. A lot of the organisms that make shells, like coral or clams or mussels or oysters, use carbonate ions in their shell structure, and they need carbonate available for them to be able to build a shell. But if there's no carbonate available, because it's now bound up as bicarbonate ion or carbonic acid, then they can't build shells and their shells get very weak, which means that if you are a coral, your skeleton is now weak. If a hurricane comes through, you're going to rip to shreds. Further to that, combine for corals warming of the oceans. Corals live very close to the surface of the ocean because they need sunlight to be able to photosynthesize. Coral works with a photosynthetic symbiotic algae that lives in their bodies, and that gives the coral food through photosynthesis. And the coral skeletal structure gives the algae a place to live. These algae actually cause the coral to have their color. But if these algae get too hot, they emergency eject out of the coral and won't come back until things cool down. If the corals don't have the algae, they can't get enough food. So not only are their skeletons weakened by the fact that carbonic acid is forming in their oceans, but now they're slowly starving to death. So corals are a keystone species, which mean that they uphold a disproportionately large majority of the biodiversity in an ecosystem, in this case, a coral reef ecosystem. And without it, those corals, then there's no habitat for other organisms on long haul journeys across the ocean to stop for food. So corals are very, very important in ocean health. And if they die, then many other species will too. So how do we prevent this? One thing that's being talked about is how do we sequester carbon? That sequester means how do we capture it and store it? So this is an image of peat here. Obviously, we don't want to be harvesting peat. We don't want to be burning peat. This is something that they do in Finland, burn peat, and it has been on the radar for a number of years that this needs to stop because burning peat, peat is decayed organic matter in waterlogged soils. Burning it releases a lot a disproportionate amount of carbon dioxide, more so than something like coal. And if it gets dried out in those swampy areas where it's being harvested, then the forest fire risk can be very high. And if a fire gets into the underground peat system, it can burn underground for years and years and years. And this has actually happened in Indonesia. So that's one strategy, reducing burning of fossil fuels, reducing harvesting of peat. Peat is also really important for carbon sequestration. So just leaving it in, letting it sit there. But also photosynthesis is really important for storing carbon. So if that's the case, then we need to be planting more trees. But the downside on that is that planting trees takes a lot of time and money, and trees take a long time to grow. And so also, if water patterns, rainfall patterns are changing, then those trees may or may not have enough water to grow effectively. More money has been put into how do we capture carbon mechanically. And then some countries like Iceland are now looking into capturing carbon dioxide and pumping it into rocks underground for storage as rock material. So that may be the best strategy for carbon sequestration, but most of those mechanical options have not been scaled up large enough at this point for it to be sufficient. All right, so to summarize, as you can see from the pictures, it's looking a little grim. Greenhouse gases cause the greenhouse effect by trapping and reflecting infrared radiation. Climate change causes positive feedback loops that amplify climate change. This can lead to tipping points where irreversible change is happening. And the solution, massive reduction in carbon dioxide emissions and carbon sequestration. So if you are SL, you can stop watching here. HL, there's 2 more slides for you guys to go. So phenology is the study of timing and seasonal activities for plants and animals. Many plants and animals are affected by day length, so that would affect their migration patterns. There's something called long and short day plants, so that's going to affect when they flower, whether it's when the nights are long or the days are long. And then some organisms are affected by temperature. So for example, when will leaves grow on trees? Migration is dictated by day length, and that's going to be unrelated to climate change. So climate change is not affecting how our planet orbits the sun, but temperature will affect food resources that will be available for those birds. So this here is a picture of a great tit. Yes, I know you're all chuckling by this name. They live in Finland. They eat caterpillars, but by the time they arrive, peak caterpillar biomass season has passed. And so they need to go further and further north so that they can follow those bugs, so that they can have enough food to feed to their chicks so that they can raise eggs effectively. Additionally, if we're thinking about temperature and how it affects plants, we sometimes see this in Finland as well. If we have a really warm snap in March, let's say, or early April, then the trees are all going to start budding and their leaves are going to come out. But then if it starts snowing in May, then those leaves are going to really, really struggle, and the trees are going to really struggle because the leaves become damaged in the snowfall, and then they can't photosynthesize properly. So if the temperature of the environment is not consistent, this can also be highly problematic. And it's even more problematic for food sources. So like birch trees are pretty resilient, but tomatoes are definitely not. Another example of this for phenology being caribou eat mouse ear plant, which grows in the Arctic. It used to be available for spring-born calves, baby caribou, in the spring, and that was why they migrated at the time that they did. But then mouse ear plant is not growing the same way that it used to. So food sources are reduced, which then means that the calves can't get as much food, which stunts their growth and limits their health. And then they're more prone to being hunted by like wolves, for example, or dying due to malnutrition. And then lastly is an example of what's going on in the forests. This is quite a problem in Canada. So bark beetles have infected pine trees in British Columbia, where I'm from. When the weather is warm, the bark beetle larvae survive the winter and then they develop faster. So instead of a life cycle taking 2 years, which it will if it's like a -40-degree winter, then it's going to take 1 year. And this allows these beetles to attack the trees more frequently and in higher numbers. The trees are stressed because of low water conditions and additional attacks by these beetles. So their immune systems are less effective at fighting off the beetle attacks. And eventually the forests start to die. So you can see here all of this red, this is dead pine trees. And if your forest is filled with dead pine trees, they're like tiny little matchsticks just waiting to go up in flames, which is why Canada is struggling so much with forest fires these years, because bark beetles are killing off a lot of the trees. And additionally, it's very, very dry. So almost anything will set the forest off fire. All right, that is it. I'm sorry, this is a depressing video to watch. Thank you for watching, and I hope it was mostly understandable.